Dawn never truly arrived on the ridgeline east of Anzio on February 7, 1944. The sky did not brighten. It simply shifted from ink black to a heavier, more reluctant gray, as though the sun itself hesitated to look upon a place already thick with fear and frozen mud. The air was cold enough to sting the inside of a man's nose. Every breath came out in pale ribbons that dissolved before reaching the next ridge. Mud pulled greedily at boots, wet earth swallowing half a soul with every cautious step. Wind threaded itself through the broken rocks like something alive, humming low, carrying the distant thump of artillery fired from positions far behind the line. Private First Class Roland Rowley Mercer exhaled slowly and felt his breath wrap around his cheeks before disappearing. He had slept less than 2 hours, though sleep was too generous a word for the nervous half-dreams soldiers drifted in and out of when they knew the morning was going to demand something terrible. His gloves were damp from frost and sweat. He wiped a thin trail of condensation from the receiver of his Browning M1919A4, feeling the familiar ridges and rivets along the frame. The weapon sat on a low tripod inside a shallow foxhole of loose stones and scraped earth. It was officially labeled a machine gun position, but the truth was harsher. It was barely a dent in the hillside, a place where a determined enemy could land a grenade with only one lucky toss. Hill 119 lay in front of him like a sleeping creature, its curves and ridges forming a natural barrier between the American line and the thick network of German infiltration routes beyond. Control of the hill meant control of the valley. If Hill 119 fell, the battalion's flank would fold like wet paper, and the entire defensive arc east of Anzio would collapse with it. Mercer knew this because his platoon sergeant had repeated it 4 times the night before, each time rubbing his temples as though the very thought gave him a headache. There were supposed to be 2 machine gun crews here, 2 guns to rake the slopes, 2 belts of fire crossing like intersecting blades. But the second gun was gone. A well-placed German mortar round the previous night had turned that position into a muddy crater, its crew half buried, their weapons shattered. Mercer and his assistant gunner, Private Coleman, now carried the burden alone. The closest reinforcements were more than 40 minutes away. Artillery support had been redirected toward a separate sector after midnight. The radio had begun to crackle with static so thick that it sounded like someone pouring sand onto the speaker. Mercer did not think about any of that. He only listened. The mountain was too quiet. At first, he assumed it was simply the strange stillness that sometimes occurs before dawn, when even the wind seems to wait for something. But then he saw movement. Small, quick, and wrong. Shadow peeled itself from the fog along the northern slope. A runner. German. He was lean and urgent, carrying no rifle, wearing no pack. He moved with the certainty of someone who had run this approach 100 times, in darkness and daylight. Mercer tracked him with the iron sights for a moment. Steady hands, steady breathing. He could have fired. He knew that. But a runner alone meant very little. A runner meant warning. A runner meant something else was coming behind him. The silhouette paused halfway across the slope, crouched low, and studied the hilltop. Mercer did not move. Neither did Coleman. The runner's head turned once, sharply, and then he sprinted out of sight. For 3 long seconds, nothing happened. Then the mountain breathed. Not wind, not birds, not shifting branches. Men. From the folds of the terrain below, 200 German infantry, veterans of the 715 Infantry Division, hardened by months on the Eastern Front, began rising from the ground like shadows, stepping out of deeper shadows. They moved in practiced silence, rifles slung behind their backs for speed, boots cutting through the frozen mud with swift precision. Even from this distance, Mercer could sense the rhythm of their advance. Disciplined, coordinated, deliberate. These were not green troops. These were assault specialists, shaped by winters where hesitation meant death. Smoke began to drift across the lower slope, rolling from canisters thrown deliberately to obscure their assembly. It was not a chaotic cloud. It was structured, layered, designed to open and close like curtains as they shifted upward. The first mortars thumped a moment later, the distant hollow sound climbing the hillside like a warning heartbeat. Mercer swallowed once. He had known they were coming. Everyone on the hill had known. But knowing was not the same as seeing. 200 men, 200 trained infantrymen advancing toward a ridgeline defended by a single machine gun position with one functioning weapon. And that weapon, powerful as it was, could not cover every angle. The hill's slopes were too wide, its folds too deep. Mercer glanced at Coleman. The assistant gunner sat low beside him, coiled and pale, one hand gripping the ammunition box as if steadying himself. His eyes were wide but alert. Fear was there, but it had not taken over yet. "They're coming," Mercer said softly. Though the words were obvious and unnecessary, Coleman nodded. The narrator's lens would linger here, on the small motions that amounted to ritual for men about to be tested beyond reason. The tightening of a helmet strap, the subtle shift of weight in the foxhole, the fingers tracing the cool metal of a weapon as though it were a living thing, the way breath clouds evaporated faster now that adrenaline sharpened the blood. Another mortar exploded against the east face of the ridge, shaking loose a shower of dirt. Smoke thickened at the base of the slope. The German formation was nearly invisible now, but Mercer could hear them. Boots, low commands, equipment clattering lightly against belts. The attack was forming. Hill 119, the hill that refused to wake, was about to be hit by 200 charging men. And Private First Class Roland Mercer tightened his grip on the Browning, leaned forward, and prepared to fire. Private First Class Roland Mercer did not always distrust the manual. When he first arrived in Italy in late December of 1943, he kept the U.S. Army Machine Gun Field Guide folded inside the breast pocket of his jacket like a small talisman. The pages were creased, stained with oil, and dog-eared from nervous rereading during long nights in frozen vineyards. The doctrine felt safe, authoritative, something solid in a war where very little stayed solid for long. The manual had one unwavering instruction about the Browning, M1919A4. Short bursts, 5 rounds, maybe 7. Never more. Preserve the barrel, maintain control. Predictability equals discipline. That phrase, predictability equals discipline, had been drilled into every machine gun class Mercer attended. And then January happened. It was near Caraceto, just southwest of the Anzio perimeter, on a morning cold enough to make fingers numb before a man finished lacing his boots. Mercer's platoon had been ordered to support a thin line of riflemen holding a shallow rise against repeated German probes. The gun crew Mercer was attached to. Veterans, calm, sure of themselves, set up their M1919 behind a low stone wall. They followed the manual perfectly. The first German rush came through the olive trees like a gray wave. 10 men at a time, moving with the clipped, predatory gait of soldiers who had learned how to sprint between danger. The American gunner fired 3 clean bursts, each exactly the length he'd been trained to deliver. 5 rounds, 7 rounds, 5 again. Textbook. Mercer had watched from 20 yards back, carrying an ammunition can, ready to replace the spent belts. He remembered the sound of those bursts, crisp, controlled, evenly spaced. He remembered something else too. Between each burst, the Germans moved. Not recklessly, not wildly, but rhythmically. One group sprinted during the first pause, dropping flat the instant the second burst began. The next group mirrored them during the second pause. Then a third, a fourth. They flowed between the bursts the way dancers slip into opening steps between drum beats. The stone wall crumbled under the pressure of grenades lobbed from short range. The American gunner tried to compensate by firing longer bursts, but it was too late. The Germans had already crossed the fatal distance. When the gun jammed from heat and dust, the enemy was close enough to smell the sweat on the American crew. Mercer survived only because he had been positioned behind the main line to run ammunition. The gun crew did not. The clung riflemen in the foxholes to either side did not. A single breach in the firing rhythm had doomed them all. That night, Mercer sat alone in a half-collapsed barn, staring at his own M1919, listening to distant artillery stutter on the horizon. He replayed the scene again and again. The manual had told them what to do. The gunner had done everything right. And yet the enemy had treated the bursts like steps on a staircase, pacing their charge in the spaces between danger. Predictability equals discipline. The phrase now felt like a death sentence. He pressed the heel of his palm against his forehead until he saw sparks behind his eyes. There had to be a way to suppress movement without giving the enemy a rhythm to exploit. Something irregular, something uncomfortably chaotic, something the Germans could not time their sprints against. That was when he picked up a stick. In the dirt beside the barn, he began tracing imaginary burst patterns, short scratches, long ones, diagonals that represented pivots of the gun. He whispered through clenched teeth, 3, pause, 9, pivot, 5, half pause, 3. The pattern looked nonsensical, but it felt right. It felt wrong enough to break expectations, sharp enough to tear apart the enemy's sprint calculations. He practiced the pattern every night afterward. Not with the gun. That would have drawn unwanted attention and invited reprimand. But with his finger or a stick, carving invisible bursts onto the cold ground. Coleman, who bunked beside him, sometimes woke to find Mercer sitting upright, elbows on his knees, drawing lines on the floorboards as though deciphering some secret code. When the platoon sergeant finally caught him practicing with an empty belt fed through the gun, he exploded. "You keep firing like that," the sergeant growled, "and you'll burn out the barrel, jam the weapon, and get yourself court-martialed. Short bursts, Mercer. Always short bursts." Mercer nodded. He apologized. He folded the manual neatly, but he did not stop practicing. He could not. Not after Caraceto. Back on Hill 119, with 200 Germans shaping their assault behind thickening smoke, Mercer's pulse drummed in his ears. This time he was not 20 yards behind the line. He was the line. If he repeated the doctrine, the enemy would time him just as before. They would reach his foxhole, his thin rim of stones, his assistant gunner, his ammunition belts. He flexed his gloved fingers once, twice. Then he looked at Coleman and said quietly, "Get ready." The mountain below them was moving. The smoke curled upward like a living thing, swallowing the lower slope, expanding as the German assault leaders hurled more canisters to widen the concealment. Mercer could hear faint whistles, signals, not alarms. The assault was coordinated, calculated. Rushing machine guns was an art the veterans of the 715 Division understood with crushing precision. The manual would not stop them. Only something unpredictable could. In the cold weight of that moment, Mercer realized he was about to commit an act that broke doctrine, defied regulation, and invited punishment, but might save the hill. He settled behind the Browning. He laid his cheek against the cold stock. He felt the earth tremble beneath the approaching boots, and in the rising smoke, he prepared to fire the rhythm no manual had ever written. Private First Class Roland Mercer had known from the first night he imagined it that his firing method was forbidden. Not discouraged, not frowned upon, forbidden. Every chapter in the Browning M1919 A4 manual warned against sustained or irregular bursts. Every training sergeant he had ever met lectured about the dangers of unpredictable firing. Barrel overheating, ammunition waste, erratic recoil, reduced accuracy, jam risk. The Army believed a machine gunner should be a metronome, steady, reliable, consistent. Mercer intended to be anything but consistent. As the German smoke spread across the lower half of Hill 119, thickening into a pale wall that billowed like a living thing, Mercer slid the first belt into place. Coleman locked the cover down, with hands that trembled only slightly. The faint metallic click seemed small against the growing roar of 200 boots beating the frozen mud below. "Raleigh," Coleman whispered, "what's your plan?" Mercer did not answer. Not because he was ignoring the question, but because he could not yet articulate the truth. "I'm about to break every rule they taught us." He braced the weapon, leaned forward, and felt the cold metal settle into the crook of his shoulder. The Browning's weight was familiar, comforting even. It was not a graceful weapon. It was a blunt, industrial machine built to spit defiance across an open field. But Mercer had spent enough nights rehearsing imaginary patterns to know how it reacted, how it bucked, how it walked under continuous fire. The Germans emerged through the smoke not as a single wave, but as three distinct assault groups. One center, two flank elements, each moving with frightening discipline. Mercer could see their outlines. Crouched, low silhouettes carrying carbines, machine pistols, grenades wired to belts. Veterans. Men who knew how to charge a position without hesitating. In that instant, Mercer felt a familiar dread press against his ribs. Memories of Caraquetto, of the disciplined bursts, the predictable pauses, the way the enemy had flowed into the gaps. He saw it again, superimposed over the present moment. Not this time. Not here. He gripped the trigger. Then he began the rhythm. 3 shots. Sharp, precise cracks. A heartbeat of silence. 9 shots. Longer, brutal, ripping the air apart. Immediate pivot left. 5 shots, angled downward across the slope. Half pause. 3 shots again, this time higher, sweeping a different lane of approach, the firing. Pattern sounded wrong. It sounded broken. It sounded like a weapon malfunctioning. And that was exactly why it worked. The first German assault group hesitated. It was almost imperceptible, half a step, 1 fraction of a second. But Mercer saw it. They could not time the pattern. The pause they expected after the first bursts did not come. The pivot happened too soon. The next burst came too late. Everything was offbeat. Coleman stared at Mercer in disbelief. "That's not regulation," he muttered. "No," Mercer said softly. "It's not." The Browning clattered and bucked, recoil thudding through Mercer's arms in uneven jolts. But he controlled it with an instinct that came from hours of silent practice in the dark. The barrel smoked quickly, quicker than doctrine permitted. But Coleman was already preparing the spare, sweat forming beneath his helmet, despite the cold. The German flanking element attempted to rush on the right, sprinting through a thin gap in the smoke. Mercer saw them. He shifted, not with the smooth, sweeping motion of a textbook traverse, but with a jagged pivot that sent a stuttering volley across their advance. The irregularity of the burst forced them to drop to the ground mid-sprint, stumbling, sliding in the mud. The center group wavered. The flank groups slowed. Not because they were pinned, not because the Browning's fire was especially accurate, but because the rhythm frightened them. Humans could survive predictable danger. They could time it. They could adapt to it. But unpredictable danger, chaos with no pattern, paralyzed movement. Mercer was creating chaos. The barrel grew hotter. Smoke curled upward in thin blue lines. Mercer smelled heated oil and metal. His gloves warmed uncomfortably. He knew he was pushing the weapon past its safe limit. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he could hear his sergeant's voice roaring warnings about warped barrels and inoperable bolts. But he kept firing. 3 shots. Pause. 9 shots. Sharp pivot. 5 shots. Half pause. 3 more. Coleman shouted, "Barrel's getting too hot!" But Mercer hardly registered the words. His entire focus narrowed to the terrain, to the movement, to the strange music of the firing pattern. Below him, the Germans tried again. A group of 10 broke from the main line, attempting to sprint during one of the pauses. Mercer anticipated their timing, then cut the pause short, firing a crippling volley that tore through the open space they had committed to crossing. They dove back toward the lower slope, scrambling for cover. The rhythm held. Mercer could feel his heart pounding in his throat. Sweat trickled down his spine. His ears rang from the uneven roar of the Browning. The world had narrowed to the trigger beneath his finger, the barrel glowing faintly through the smoke, and the enemy struggling to decipher the pattern he had crafted in a quiet barn at Caraqueto. Mercer did not know if the weapon would last. He did not know if his hands would. He only knew one truth. Predictability had killed men. Unpredictability might save them. And so, on Hill 119, with 200 German infantry pressing upward through smoke and cold and mud, Mercer kept firing the illegal rhythm. The rhythm no manual had ever taught, the rhythm no sergeant would approve, the rhythm that just might stop an entire assault dead on the hillside. For a moment, a thin sliver of time barely wider than a heartbeat, Hill 119 looked like it might hold. Private First Class Roland Mercer's irregular rhythm had carved hesitation into the German advance, scattering their first wave into uneven clumps. The Browning's roar ricocheted across the hillside in broken, unpredictable bursts that made even veteran infantry slow their steps. But the pause did not last, because trained soldiers adapt quickly, and the men of the German 715 Infantry Division were nothing if not trained. From the shifting smoke curtain below, new commands rose. Short, sharp, barked orders in German. A whistle shrilled once. Another voice repeated the signal. Then the enemy reorganized with startling precision, emerging from the haze in 3 staggered lines. Mercer saw it immediately. "They're adjusting," he muttered. Coleman swallowed. Already? Veterans learn fast. The Germans advanced again, not in a single reckless charge, but in a coordinated, layered push. The first line moved low and fast, their bodies angled to reduce silhouette. The second line advanced more slowly, rifles ready to fire from kneeling positions. The third remained back, sweeping side to side to identify firing angles. 200 men, 1 gun, 1 illegally improvised rhythm. The math was obscene. Mercer adjusted the elevation crank with a practiced twist of his wrist. He drew a deep breath, tasting smoke and cold, and resumed the rhythm. 3 shots. Pause. 9. Pivot left. 5. Half pause. 3 again. The Browning spit brass casings in a steady, chaotic rain. They filled the shallow foxhole, clinking against Coleman's boots. The barrel smoked continuously now, venting heat that wavered in the frigid morning air. The right flank Germans attempted a wide sweep around a low outcrop, hoping to bypass Mercer's primary lane of fire. Mercer saw their movement through the thinning mud-gray mist. Without warning, he pivoted the Browning violently to the right and poured a ragged volley into the space they had expected to be clear. The sudden lateral burst caught them mid-stride. One man dropped instantly. Another stumbled, his helmet spinning away. The rest dove behind rubble and low brush, pinned by fire that shifted too quickly to analyze. The center group pressed harder, using the smoke as cover. Mercer fired a 9-round burst into the midpoint of their formation, then swung upward and stitched a 3-round line above their heads, forcing them low again. A pause. A 5-round volley. Another half-pause. Nothing lined up with their expectations. Coleman shouted over the gunfire, "They're still coming!" "I know." The Browning's barrel shimmered with heat. The metal felt hot, even through Mercer's gloves. Sweat rolled down his temples beneath his helmet. His shoulders burned with the strain of managing the weapon's recoil, which hammered unpredictably against the rugged earth bank. The Germans pushed in closer. Mortar rounds bracketed the hillside, deep thumps followed by bursts of dirt spraying upward in arching fountains. One explosion rattled Mercer so violently that he almost lost the rhythm entirely. Clods of mud rained down on the foxhole, pattering against helmets, stinging exposed skin. Coleman coughed, spitting out dust. "We can't take many more of those." Mercer didn't answer. He couldn't afford to. Below them, the left flank German squad began sprinting uphill in short, intermittent bursts, perfectly timed with the detonations. They were using the shock waves to mask movement. Mercer cut a sharp burst across their path. But they continued zigzagging toward a low embankment that would put them dangerously close. The hillside trembled, not from mortars, but from massed momentum. The enemy was closing the distance, pressing into effective grenade range. Mercer's rhythm might disrupt timing, but it couldn't stop a determined mass forever. His heart hammered. His breaths came sharp and fast. He felt the raw truth settling into his bones. If he faltered for even 2 seconds, the hill was gone. He fired again. 3 shots, 9 shots, pivot, 5. Forcing the center lane to stall. The Germans ducked, tripping over each other as the unpredictable bursts tore through the patches of smoke that still clung to the lower slope. But beyond the smoke, more appeared. Not a runner this time, not a scout, an entire platoon. Fresh silhouettes, new momentum, the second wave. Mercer felt his stomach tighten. "Coleman," he said, voice low and grim. "Feed the next belt." Coleman fumbled only slightly before snapping the next ammunition belt into place. His face was gray with fear, but unwavering. "They're not stopping," he whispered. "They don't," Mercer replied. And so the rhythm continued. Mercer's illegal, improvised, desperate rhythm, rattling across Hill 119 in jagged staccato bursts. Psychologically disruptive, tactically dishonest, militarily irreverent, but effective. Mercer pivoted hard left, then right. He sent short bursts into smoke pockets, long bursts into open lanes, forcing the Germans to break formation. The hillside became a chaotic swirl of scrambling shapes, slipping in mud, diving for cover. Still they advanced. Still they adjusted. Still they pressed toward the thin crest where one machine gun nest, scarcely more than a mud-rimmed trench, stood between a battalion and annihilation. The narrative lens would widen here, framing the hill as a basumit, living stage beneath a gray sky, smoke swirling like curtains, the German lines shifting like actors in a deadly choreography. And at the center of that stage sat Mercer, shoulders hunched, eyes narrowed, breathing hard, fighting not just with a machine gun, but with mathematics, timing, psychology, and sheer, stubborn will. 200 men, 1 gun, one rhythm. The outcome of the battle was not decided yet. But Hill 119 was no longer silent. It was screaming back. Private First Class Roland Mercer did not hear his own breathing anymore. The roar of the Browning M1919A4 swallowed everything. Fear, cold, exhaustion, until only the rhythm remained. The Germans pressed closer through the smoke, reshaping their assault tactics with every second. And Mercer's illegal firing pattern strained against the sheer weight of numbers. The second wave reached the mid-slope just as the first wave scattered into broken fragments of men crawling behind shattered rocks. 200 attackers had become something more dangerous. 150 determined survivors who now understood the strange unpredictability of Mercer's bursts. They no longer rushed recklessly. They advanced with jagged care, matching his lateral pivots and bracing for his sudden volleys. Mercer felt the shift immediately. "They're reading it," he muttered. Coleman heard him over the thunderous firing. "Can you change it?" Mercer did not respond at once. He adjusted the tripod elevation wheel by instinct, raising the barrel a hair. Just enough to sweep the next ridgeline, where figures moved in staggered formation. The Germans were firing back now. Short, sharp rifle shots, cracking past the foxhole. Machine pistol bursts tearing into the mud inches from Coleman's boots. He needed a new rhythm. But improvise too far, and the gun would jam. Improvise too little, and the Germans would time his shots again. He wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. The barrel glowed faintly, dull, angry red beneath the rising smoke. "Coleman," he said, voice gravelly, "load the spare barrel. Get it ready. We're going to need it soon." Coleman reached for the wrapped cylinder, hands trembling from cold and terror. "How long do we have?" Mercer listened. Not to the gunfire, not to the wind, but to the footfalls of the enemy below. 200 men had begun the ascent. Now fewer moved, but they were closer, more coordinated, angrier. "Seconds," Mercer said. "Maybe seconds." He shifted his firing pattern, cutting the 9-shot segment into 2 uneven bursts, then replacing the 5-shot volley with a quick double tap. The Germans flinched again, their advance interrupted by the surprise shift. The change bought them maybe 4 seconds, 4 seconds that meant everything. Mortar rounds continued pounding the hillside. One exploded directly above them, showering the foxhole with burning fragments of soil and rock. Mercer ducked instinctively, shielding his face with his arm. Coleman yelped as a shard of stone sliced across his sleeve. The hill shook under their feet. "You good?" Mercer shouted. "Still here," Coleman shouted back, though his voice wavered. A German squad broke through the thinning smoke on the right flank, 8 men sprinting uphill with terrifying speed, using the chaos of the mortar blasts for cover. Their boots slapped the mud in erratic cadence, their shouts echoing upward. Mercer pivoted sharply, unleashing an uneven volley, 3 shots, split pause, 7 shots, and cut the squad in half. 2 men fell instantly. The others dove behind a low ridge, trapped for the moment, but still dangerously close. More rifle shots snapped overhead. The Germans were now within what infantry manuals called dangerously effective range. Any shot that left a rifle barrel had a real chance of finding a target. Mercer leaned into the Browning. His shoulders screamed from tension. His arms trembled, not from fear but from the physical punishment of absorbing so much recoil. He forced himself to breathe. Focus, pivot, suppress, disrupt. The Germans pressed again. Another group, 12 this time, attempted a flanking maneuver on the left. Mercer cut them off with a savage burst that walked across the slope, bullets chewing into the ground and forcing them prone. Mud exploded around their bodies as they scrambled for shallow depressions. They're going to rush all at once, Coleman warned. One big push. I know. Can you stop them? Mercer tightened his grip on the pistol grip. His gloves were soaked with sweat. His knuckles ached. Yet the answer came without hesitation. I have to. He shifted the rhythm again. Short, short, long, pivot, short, long, short, and let the pattern tear across the hillside. He wasn't following any sequence now. He was feeling it, adjusting instinctively to the enemy's movement, to the sound of their boots, to the fleeting shapes that emerged from the smoke. Then came the moment he feared, a harsh, metallic warning. The barrel heat reached critical. The weapon's recoil changed tone. The gunfire sounded strained, angry, unstable. Barrel! Mercer barked. Coleman moved, fast. In one motion, he seized the spare barrel, yanked the locking latch, and shoved the overheated shroud aside. Steam burst upward as freezing air hit the glowing steel. Coleman's hands shook violently, but he forced the cool barrel into place, twisted it, locked it. Go! Mercer resumed firing. The Germans tried their massed rush, dozens charging uphill, shouting in German, hoping sheer momentum would break the defense. Mercer unleashed the most violent, irregular storm of fire he had produced yet. The new barrels sang, spitting tracer lines into the smoke. Bullets ripped through charging silhouettes. The hillside erupted with mud, screams, confusion. The charge faltered, stalled, failed. Men rolled back down the slope. Others crawled for cover. The momentum broke like a snapped rope. Coleman stared in disbelief. I think you stopped them. Mercer didn't reply. His ears rang, his shoulders heaved. Smoke drifted around them like low fog. The hill was holding, but only by seconds, and only because one man refused to fire the way he'd been taught. For the first time since dawn, the Germans hesitated. Not a full stop, just a slowing, a collective intake of breath as the hillside swallowed their momentum. Private First Class Roland Mercer felt it in the air, sensed it in the brief lull between rifle cracks and mortar bursts. But a lull was not safety. A lull was the inhale before something worse. The smoke drifted thinly now, stretched into weary ribbons by the wind. Through it, Mercer saw movement, careful, coordinated, purposeful. German squad leaders were shouting terse commands, motioning their men not backward, but around. They were repositioning, reconfiguring, rebuilding the assault like a machine resetting itself. Raleigh, Coleman said, his voice tight. They're not done. Mercer shook his head. They won't be done until we're dead or out of ammo. Coleman checked the remaining belts, 2 left. Maybe enough for several minutes. Maybe not enough for one. Below them, the Germans shifted formation again. They were tightening, drawing closer to one another, preparing for a final push. And as the smoke thinned, Mercer saw why. They were within 40 yards. 40 yards was not an attack distance. 40 yards was execution range. Mercer felt his heart drop, but his hands remained steady. He lowered the Browning by a fraction, adjusting angle and elevation until the barrel pointed into the densest knot of approaching men. At this range, a machine gun was not a tool of suppression. It was a blade. He resumed firing. But something had changed. At 40 yards, the irregular rhythm did not simply confuse attackers. It physically broke them. The first bursts tore through the front line, sending bodies collapsing into the mud. The sudden violence shook the men behind them, forcing them to stumble, trip, and fall over those already hit. Still, they came. A German grenadier sprinted forward, rising from a crouch with a stick grenade in hand. Mercer cut a 3-shot burst across his waist. dropping him mid-stride. Another man dashed toward the right side of the slope. Mercer pivoted sharply and stitched a line across his chest. A third crawled low, trying to close the last 20 yards. Mercer's next volley caught him just as he raised his rifle. The Browning thundered, coughing brass in golden arcs. Every shot felt like it cost a year of Mercer's life. Every pivot felt like lifting 100 pounds. Sweat poured down his spine despite the cold. His gloves were slick with a mix of condensation and fear. But Mercer was not the only one fighting. 3 Germans broke through the left flank, men who had crawled low, unseen through the smoke and mud. They appeared suddenly, close enough for Mercer to smell the sweat on their uniforms. Coleman shouted a warning and grabbed his M1 rifle, firing wildly. 1 German staggered, wounded. The other 2 charged. Mercer ripped the Browning from its traverse, hauling the heavy weapon by brute force and unleashing a point-blank burst. The muzzle roared fire just feet from the attackers. Both dropped instantly, skidding downhill in twin trails of blood and mud. Coleman exhaled shakily. "They're on top of us." "They're trying to be," Mercer growled. Another mortar round exploded behind them, showering the foxhole with dirt and rock shards. Mercer coughed, spitting earth from his mouth. The concussion shook the weapon, rattling his teeth. The Germans were directing fire not to destroy the position, but to blind it, to keep Mercer from seeing the next rush. He fired anyway. Short bursts, long bursts, half pause, pivot, reverse pivot. Everything he had practiced, everything he had imagined in that barn outside Caracheto, now flowed through him like muscle memory, sharpened by terror. His shoulder burned. His ears rang. The barrel glowed again, still cooler than the last one, but heating fast. Beyond the thinning smoke, he saw silhouettes regrouping. Another push forming. "How many left?" Coleman asked. Mercer didn't know the number. He only knew too many were still alive. The Germans surged again, 20, maybe more, charging with desperate resolve, eyes wild, teeth gritted. They were close enough now that Mercer could see individual expressions, close enough to hear shouts, curses, screams. The final 40 yards had become 20. Mercer changed rhythm again, not out of strategy, out of instinct, raw and primal. 3 fast bursts. 1 long scream of fire, an abrupt stop, another burst, 2 more. The unpredictable chaos tore into the German front ranks, shredding the charge before it could collide with the foxhole. Men fell in tousled heaps, others dropping to their knees, sliding backward, scrambling for cover. Still, a handful pushed on. 1 German, bold or broken enough to survive pure fear, leapt over a low ledge and sprinted toward Mercer's position with a grenade raised high. Coleman screamed, "Rolly!" Mercer did not think. He pivoted the Browning with a violent wrench and fired a 3-shot burst so close, the heat singed the man's sleeve as he fell backward, the grenade rolling from his hand and exploding far downhill. The shockwave flattened a strip of grass and left Mercer's ears ringing like struck bells. For several seconds, the battlefield fell strangely quiet. Then Merkel heard it. Retreat whistles, calls in German to fall back, shuffling shapes dragging wounded men downhill. The final 40 yards had broken them. Coleman sagged in the foxhole, chest heaving. "Did we win?" Mercer looked down the slope, smoke curling in thin, ghostly trails, bodies scattered like dark stones in churned mud. He did not answer. Because Hill 119 had not been won. It had merely survived. For now. For nearly a full minute, 60 stretched out, breathless seconds, Hill 119 held its silence like a stunned witness. Smoke drifted in torn ribbons across the slope, the remnants of the German assault curling upward as if unsure whether to rise or collapse. The wind returned in low, cautious pulses, bending charred grass and carrying the faint metallic tang of spent ammunition. Private First Class Roland Mercer did not trust the silence. He did not trust the quiet. Quiet, in his experience, was only the battlefield's way of inhaling before it screamed again. His hands throbbed from gripping the Browning M1919A4 too tightly. Sweat chilled on the back of his neck. His heartbeat pounded against his ribs in solid, painful pulses. Coleman lay half-sprawled beside him, gasping, one hand still gripping the empty M1 rifle he had fired in panic moments earlier. "Is it over?" Coleman asked, voice barely above a whisper. Mercer scanned the slope. Bodies were scattered like broken branches across the muddy incline. Some lay still. Others writhed or crawled. The Germans who could still move were dragging wounded comrades back down the hill, retreating toward the tree line below. A few cast wary glances toward the crest, as if expecting Mercer to renew fire. He did not. He couldn't. The Browning barrel still smoked, faint coils rising from its length. The weapon felt exhausted, like a living creature that had spent every last ounce of strength to keep both men alive. "I don't know if it's over," Mercer answered honestly. "But they're not charging anymore." Coleman exhaled shakily, shoulders sagging. "Thank God." Mercer didn't say it aloud, but he knew the truth. God had little to do with it. Survival had been carved from fear, instinct, and the illegal rhythm he had forced through the weapon. He glanced at the spent ammunition belts piled around the foxhole, brass casings glinting like pale gold in the weak morning light. They had fired almost everything. Then, like a cough breaking through a silent church, a single rifle shot cracked from somewhere far below. Mercer ducked reflexively. Coleman flinched. Both waited. No follow-up. Just one parting shot from a retreating German marksman, taking his last spiteful chance. The quiet returned. And then, faintly at first, Mercer heard voices behind him. American voices, shouting, calling, boots running over hard earth. Reinforcements. They arrived not with dramatic fanfare, not with triumphant shouts, but with the breathless disbelief of men who expected to find the crest overrun. A squad from the adjacent company reached the foxhole first. A sergeant and 6 riflemen, eyes wide, rifles at the ready. "Jesus Christ," one whispered as he took in the field. "What the hell happened here?" The sergeant, At.a, broad-shouldered man with mud-caked trousers, crouched beside the foxhole. "You two held this alone?" Coleman nodded weakly. "He did," he said, jerking his chin toward Mercer. "Mostly him." Mercer shook his head. "We both did." The sergeant surveyed the slope again, the bodies, the churned mud, the shredded patches of smoke still clinging to the low ground. 200 men had charged uphill. The fact that any Americans still stood at the crest was a miracle, or something uncomfortably close to it. "You boys did something damn near impossible," the sergeant said quietly. Mercer didn't feel pride. He felt empty, drained like the hill had taken a piece of him as payment for letting him live. He sat back against the dirt wall of the foxhole and let the Browning rest across his lap. The weapon's weight felt heavier than before, as if it knew what it had done. "Why didn't you call for support?" one rifleman asked. Mercer let out a bitter laugh. "Tried. Radio's dead. Artillery was busy. Reinforcements were at least 40 minutes away." The rifleman swore softly. "Then how the hell did you hold them?" Mercer's gaze drifted to the Browning, its barrel smeared with grime, its receiver dented in places from the recoil and debris. "I broke the rules," he said simply. The sergeant raised an eyebrow. "What rules?" All of them. He explained only as much as necessary. The irregular bursts, the unpredictable rhythm, the refusal to follow the training manual's short-burst discipline. The rifleman listened with a mixture of awe and confusion. "That's not doctrine," one said. "No," Mercer replied, "but doctrine would have gotten us killed." The sergeant didn't argue. He only nodded, jaw tight, eyes lingering on the hillside where the failed German assault lay, in silent testimony. "Command needs to hear about this," he said. "They need to know what you figured out." Mercer looked away. "Command doesn't like people making things up." "Command can complain later," the sergeant replied. "Right now, you saved the entire flank. That counts for something." Medics arrived next, moving downhill to tend the wounded, German and American alike. Litter teams followed. The scene was grim, quiet, methodical. The wind carried the groans of injured men and the distant rumble of artillery, but no further gunfire. The hill, for now, was secure. Coleman looked at Mercer with tired eyes. "Rowley, we actually did it." Mercer didn't smile, couldn't. He simply nodded. "We held," he said, "but only because they stopped." He did not add the final thought weighing in his mind. If they hadn't, the hill would have fallen. Reinforcements had arrived, but too late to save the hill, only in time to witness the man who had. The sun finally broke through the gray above Hill 119 around mid-morning, though broke through was generous. It pushed a faint, sickly light across the churned mud and smoke-stained rocks, illuminating the terrible geometry of the morning's fight. Medics wove among the fallen. Stretchers creaked under the weight of wounded men, American and German alike. The smell of cordite hung stubbornly in the air. Private First Class Roland Mercer sat on the edge of the foxhole that had nearly become his grave, elbows on his knees, eyes distant. For the first time since dawn, he allowed himself to feel the cold again. It sank through his soaked gloves, crept up his sleeves, and settled into the hollow between his shoulder blades. Across from him, Coleman wrapped a bandage around a shallow graze on his arm. His face was tight with fatigue, but his voice was steady when he said, "You know they're going to want a report?" Mercer gave a weak, humorless huff. "Yeah," he murmured. "They'll want to know why I didn't follow the manual." He looked down at his Browning M1919A4, resting across his lap. It was an ugly thing now, mud-caked, dented, charred black along the barrel shroud, where the heat had almost pushed it past the point of survival. He brushed a finger along the receiver, feeling its roughness. The weapon had saved him, and he had saved it. Both had disobeyed their intended limits. A staff officer arrived soon after. Lieutenant Rourke, a man with impeccable posture even in mud, carrying a notepad and a pencil worn to half its length. He surveyed the hill, the bodies, the faint curl of smoke from the lower slope, and then fixed his eyes on Mercer. "You the gunner?" he asked. Mercer nodded. "Then you'll walk me through it." Mercer explained in short, factual fragments. The German runner, the smoke, the first wave, the switching rhythms, the pivot bursts, the overheating barrel, the final 40 yards. Rourke's pencil scratched hurriedly, pausing only when Mercer mentioned the irregular firing pattern. "You alternated bursts deliberately?" he asked. Mercer nodded. "Yes, sir." "That's not in the field manual." "No, sir." Rourke scribbled more notes, chewing the corner of his lip. "Why?" "Because they were timing the pauses," Mercer said simply. "Back in Caraquetto, I saw a whole gun crew die because they followed the book. The Germans learned our rhythm. I needed a rhythm they couldn't learn." Rourke didn't respond for several seconds. He only looked at Mercer, the mud on his uniform, the tremor in his tired hands, the blood streaking his right glove where a stone shard had cut him. This was not a man who had improvised out of arrogance. This was a man who had improvised because doing nothing would have meant death. "I see," Rourke finally said. "Your sergeant will want to read this report." Mercer swallowed. "Am I in trouble?" Rourke raised an eyebrow. "You held off 200 German assault troops with an overheated Browning and an untested firing method." He paused. "If you are trouble, then the whole army is insane." He snapped his notebook shut and walked off. Coleman let out a low whistle. "That went better than expected." Mercer didn't answer. He kept staring downhill, where the medics continued working in the aftermath. He counted the German bodies, not for triumph, not for validation, but because the mind does strange arithmetic after battle. He counted until the numbers blurred into the mud. Later, as the sun rose higher and thawed the frost from the battered hilltop, Mercer felt a numbing truth settle deep within him. He had not survived because he was brave. He had survived because he refused to die the same way good men had died before him. By early afternoon, battalion command sent word. Hill 119 would hold. Reinforcements were repositioned. Artillery would resume its support. Patrols would sweep the lower approaches. The line was secure, for now. But the story of the fight traveled faster than orders. Riflemen whispered it as they filled sandbags. Mortarmen repeated it while cleaning tubes. Even the medics spoke of it quietly as they tended the wounded. One gunner, one assistant, one hill. 200 attackers. And something no one had ever seen before. An illegal firing rhythm that left the enemy staggering. When Mercer walked toward the rear for debriefing, men he barely knew nodded at him with a strange mixture of respect and disbelief. Some clapped his shoulder. Others simply watched him pass, as though unsure whether he was lucky, crazy, or something in between. Command's official report, filed that evening, listed the action as follows. Enemy assault repelled. Heavy casualties inflicted. Defensive line maintained. Recommend further evaluation of irregular burst suppression tactics demonstrated by PFC Mercer. That was as close to praise as Army paperwork ever came. Mercer did not linger on it. He did not ask for recognition. His hands still shook slightly. His muscles felt bruised from hours of recoil. His ears rang in a high, thin tone that made voices sound distant. He lay down that night in a dugout tent behind the line. Coleman fell asleep instantly. Mercer did not. He stared at the tent canvas above him, watching the faint shadows sway in the lantern light. He thought of Carrocetto. He thought of the stone wall collapsing. He thought of the men he could not save then, and the hill he had somehow saved today. The hill had asked something brutal of him. He had answered, and in answering he had changed something. Perhaps only within himself, perhaps somewhere larger. As he finally drifted into exhausted sleep, one truth settled quietly in his mind. Sometimes the rules keep you alive, and sometimes surviving means breaking them first.